The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
Introducing Mark Gevisser is for me really a singular pleasure. I've been at the University of Chicago 31 years and can't imagine how many people I've introduced over this period. But this one is really special. Mark's a personal friend, but more than that, he is, as those of you who know anything about South Africa will know, is basically a South African national treasure. I bet you haven't been called that before, but it's true. He's one of its public intellectuals whom I most respect and admire. In our shared homeland, he is a household name, a voice that is always treated with respect in a very fractious, very argumentative environment in which respect is earned with a great deal of difficulty. Mark graduated with a degree in comparative literature from Yale in 1987, magna cum laude, and has been speaking loudly ever since. Later went on to receive an MFA from Columbia, and worked in New York writing for both the Village Voice and The Nation before returning to South Africa in 1990, where he remained the nation's South African correspondent and regularly wrote for South Africa's finest media, the Mail and Guardian, the Sunday Times, Sunday Independent, or newspapers in which fish would be very proud to be rolled up, and became one of the country's most respected journalists. His political profiles especially are well known for their extraordinary insight into his subjects of study, and have actually been collected in a volume which makes quite extraordinary reading in the genre of short biography, an extremely difficult genre, as it turns out. Mark is at once a forensic, a political, and a cultural journalist. A form of writing which is really anthropology in quick time. He's also one of South Africa's finest ethnographers and public analysts, and has published an enormously wide range of media, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Art in America, even Vogue, in which he regularly is. In addition to his articles, he has a series of well-known books to his name. The remarkable, and that's not a pun intended, Defiant Desire, Gay and Lesbian Lives in South Africa, which was published in 1994, co-edited with another remarkable and extraordinary South African, Edwin Cameron, who is now a justice on the Constitutional Court bench, was a landmark study in gay and lesbian South Africa, and again written with a kind of sensitivity and insight which only a truly remarkable journalist can achieve. His book of profiles is called Portraits of Power, Profiles in a Changing South Africa. And he's also made a documentary film, The Man Who Drove with Mandela. But his most remarkable achievement to date is his biography of Thabo Mbeki. It's called Thabo Mbeki, The Dream Deferred. It won the Alan Paton Prize for Non-Fiction Writing in South Africa, the country's most serious literary award, and it earned it. It's an extraordinary book. It's a large book. It's a thoughtful book. It's a book that recalls some of the great biographies of political figures because it was a very difficult book to write. Anybody who knows South Africa and knows Thabo Mbeki knows exactly how difficult it is to write of a sitting president, and as enigmatic a man as Thabo Mbeki has proven to be. An American version, shorter but equally punchy, is published under A Legacy of Liberation. There are copies over there, and I would strongly encourage them. I have two of my own. I can't claim to have read both, right? On the other hand, I'm working through it. The format for this evening at Mark's request is as follows. He's going to talk for half an hour to 40 minutes, and has invited a conversation. I've framed 3 questions to him from South Africa, so to speak, about recent and contemporary events and his own writings about them. And then we'll throw the conversation open to the floor. He's asked for an informal conversation. This, of course, is one of the homes of informal conversation. Mark, welcome to Chicago. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Not sure about being a national treasure. It really is wonderful to be here, not least because of the kind of bond that's developed between this university and South Africa due to the work of John and Jean Komarov. It's amazing how many smart Americans I come across in South Africa who've been through their program here. And it's amazing how many people I meet in Chicago who've spent time in South Africa as a consequence of that program too. So it's really great to be here and help facilitate the connection. I've never been to Chicago before, even though I lived in the States for many years. And last night, I came in yesterday, and last night friends of mine sort of took me walking around downtown Chicago and sort of showed me Grant Park where the Obama victory speech took place, and showed me exactly where they were standing and how they managed to get there and where the crowds were and where Obama was standing. And then I had this feeling again when I came here to Hyde Park. I was a little bit early, so I was sort of walking through these beautiful streets. And of course, I've seen images of these streets a million times on sort of perpetual loop on CNN. But there was a sort of feeling there's a feeling that I'm having at the moment of pilgrimage. And it's a wonderful feeling, and it's reminding me a lot of the way people feel often when they come to South Africa, and the pilgrimage they make to sort of see these great or talismans of our own great redemptive struggle. And the way that my friends were showing me Grant Park, or the way I was exploring Hyde Park, or the way people will sort of explore where Mandela lived on Vilakazi Street in Soweto, or where he spoke to the crowds when he was released from jail. And I was thinking about that today, and as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about something that I write about in my American edition, which is the way Obama describes how his finding of a political voice came through the anti-apartheid movement when he was a sophomore at Occidental College, didn't really know what he was doing with himself, found himself sort of on the fringes of a divestment campaign meeting, suddenly had a mic thrust in front of his mouth, and heard himself saying, without even realizing that he was saying it, that the anti-apartheid struggle, the struggle for the freedom of South Africans, was about making a choice not between black or white, but between dignity and servitude, between agency and inactivity or inertia. And that's where he says he found his political voice, through the South African struggle, in Dreams of My Father. And in fact, when he was in South Africa in 2006, at a public meeting, he told this story. And he said that he likes to tell the story, particularly to Americans, because he wants to be able to make it clear to Americans that, contrary to the way they usually think, they're not net exporters of democracy. And he said, and I'm quoting him, this is what he said in South Africa, he said, "We have also been inspired by struggles in other nations that have in turn helped shape and perfect the very freedoms and rights held dear by citizens of my own country." And I suppose that gave me cause to think. I was a student here in the early 1980s at the time of the divestment campaign, and any of you who are my age or older would probably also have found your voices to a greater or lesser extent through that campaign. There's something about the way South Africa's struggles became the great moral cause of the late 20th century, perhaps replacing the civil rights movement in the United States. And I suppose now I'm conscious of the fact that I'm in a liberated zone where you, of sorts, where you are beneficiaries of these great moral moments. and participants in them because of how you voted last year. And it seems appropriate to use this forum to think about what has happened to that great moral struggle through which Barack Obama found his political voice. I don't necessarily have an answer as to what's happened, but it's something that I'd really like to explore and discuss, and it seems like we're a small enough and intimate enough forum here that we can do so. So I'm hoping there will be quite a lot of time for engagement. I thought what I would do to open up the discussion is read an extract from the final chapter of my book, an epilogue called The Fall of Thabo Mbeki. And that's the epilogue. He fell, Thabo Mbeki, very hard. And this is the story of how and why he did. He was defeated by Jacob Zuma within the African National Congress, Jacob Zuma now being the president of South Africa. When Jacob Zuma took the podium after defeating Thabo Mbeki for the presidency of the African National Congress in December 2007, he made a point of referring to Mbeki as a comrade, a friend, and a brother. This was not simply the obligatory magnanimity of a victory speech. Mbeki and Zuma had been the closest of comrades and political partners for 3 decades, and their fallout had torn the ANC in two, paralyzing South African politics for nearly 3 years. This feud between brothers, struggle heroes who had fought side by side to liberate South Africa, seemed to carry the anxieties of an entire nation. If the Mandela years had been the era of the dream, and the Mbeki years that of the dream deferred, South Africa now found itself in a time beyond dreams. The political crisis triggered by the battle between Mbeki and Zuma forced South Africans to face the truth that they were no longer the world's greatest fairy tale, but rather a messy and unpredictable democracy with a deep history of conflict and inequality to overcome, run by flawed and self-interested men rather than saints and heroes. For all the anxiety and uncertainty this provoked, it was a necessary and very healthy maturation of the South African democracy, a coming of age. There was no final destination to some grand transition into democracy, but rather small steps taken along a road, even if this road did seem to be unendurably bumpy. Jacob Zuma's 2007 defeat of Thabo Mbeki took place at the ANC's yearly National Congress, traditionally held on the long weekend in the middle of December that heralds the beginning of the annual Christmas holidays. This year, sharing the Great North Road with the overloaded communal taxis and pickup trucks transporting people and goods to the densely populated rural areas, were buses bursting with singing comrades and arrogant cavalcades of cabinet ministers in German luxury cars, all making their way to the provincial capital of Polokwane. Polokwane has come to stand in the South African lexicon as shorthand not only for Mbeki's ignominious defeat, a tropical Waterloo, but for a threshold in the country's political life, a turning point almost as significant as Nelson Mandela's 1994 victory and the transition to democracy. Mbeki believed that Zuma's play for the presidency was part of a strategy to avoid prosecution. Zuma had been accused of being involved in fraud and racketeering charges, a fraud and racketeering case. He also worried that Zuma and his backers had no respect for the rule of law and the South African Constitution. The battle with Zuma so compromised Mbeki that not even his strongest supporters believed that he should continue to be president of the ANC. But because many felt that he was perhaps the only ANC leader who stood a chance of defeating Zuma and of keeping South Africa stable, he was nominated for the presidency of the ANC. He accepted the nomination, and so for the better part of 2007, much other activity was suspended, including the running of the state, as the two factions campaigned for support. What damaged Mbeki most was the perception that he was unwilling to step down from power. Even if Zuma did lack the judgment and the skills to be South Africa's president, Did Mbeki really believe that he was the only person who could stand against him and defeat him? His decision to make himself available for a third term mobilized support against him by people who were at best ambivalent about Zuma, but who were determined that the ANC should not fall victim to that graveyard of African democracies, the ruler for life syndrome. Many in the ANC and in the broader South African society were furious with Mbeki for fighting a battle he so obviously was going to lose. In so doing, he was handing the presidency to a deeply compromised man and preventing a viable third-way candidate from coming to the fore. The desire for renewal and accountability in the ANC was captured by the eloquent sign language that characterized the Polokwane conference. One of the delegates' favorites was the rolling of hands, a soccer expression which means remove time to substitute the player. And while the Mbeki supporters' salute was the three-fingered one, suggesting 3 terms, the Zuma supporters responded with 2 fingers, 2 terms for Mbeki, 2 terms for Zuma. The message was clear and appeared to be a blow for democracy and accountability. Zuma would be held to account exactly as Mbeki was. Once it was announced that he had defeated Mbeki, Zuma would draw the loudest applause from the delegates for acknowledging this. But such promises rang hollow in the way Zuma failed to stem or even criticize the fervent personality cult that developed around him, with some supporters saying they would kill to keep him out of jail, and with Zuma himself prone to declare that the ANC would rule until the second coming. Balanced against this development of a personality cult, however, was one of the most significant outcomes of the contest. Despite a fervently partisan nucleus in each camp, the votes were negatively driven. Very few of those who voted for Mbeki actually wanted him to remain ANC president. Most voted to keep Zuma out. Similarly, a significant proportion of the Zuma votes was a protest against Mbeki. Previously, the ANC leadership had been a pantheon of demigods beyond reproach. Now both candidates were seen as flawed and compromised. The choice was between the lesser of 2 evils. A new contestation was heralded at Polokwane, one that would change South African politics forever. At the conference, Mbeki delivered a political report more appropriate for Parliament than for a political congress. He spoke for 3 hours, stupefying delegates with facts and figures that demonstrated the achievements of his term, but failed dismally to connect with the very people whose votes he was canvassing. The speech had been calculated to demonstrate Mbeki's erudition, his precision, in sharp counterpoint to Zuma, who spoke in broad brushstrokes and who had already developed the reputation of being all things to all people, telling each audience exactly what he thought it wanted to hear. Mbeki wished to prove in contrast that he spoke the truth, no matter how unpalatable. And so he performed the spectacularly self-destructive feat of telling the very people whom he wished to vote him back into office that they were a rabble, not worthy of being at the conference in the first place, suggesting that they had been easily misled and manipulated. Thus did he confirm to the delegates what the Zuma camp had already told them, that he was high-handed and aloof, an elitist who was contemptuous towards them because they were not as educated as he. Towards the end of the speech, Mbeki finally addressed the schism in the ANC. "If we are divided, what divides us?" he asked. "You," came the answer, shouted somewhat uneasily from various corners of the floor. Mbeki looked up, a flicker registering across his habitually impassive features. He tried his question another way. "If we are divided, what should we do to address the challenge?" Awakened now, the delegates were prepared. They gave Mbeki his answer. Go. Go. A few minutes later, as he finished his marathon speech, there was respectful if restrained applause, and then open rebellion. A song ignited across the floor. Umshini wami, bring me my machine gun. An old war chant from the struggle days that Zuma had appropriated as his anthem. Mbeki supporters had decried the use of the song in a time of peace and development, and in a society trying desperately to overcome gun-driven violent crime. But with its symbolic call to arms, Umshiniwam never failed to arouse the passions of those who felt alienated from the technocratic workings of a liberation movement that was now a ruling party, who felt that despite the achievements Mbeki had detailed, they had not reaped the benefits of freedom. In the front of the Congress Hall, a block of loyalists jumped to their feet and tried unsuccessfully to counter the Zuma anthem with songs in praise of Mbeki. The president himself remained impassive as he took his seat next to Zuma, his colour ashen. Traditionally, at the end of the leader's speech, an ANC gathering erupts into a massive stamping feet, praise song, ululation. That day, the party leadership behind Mbeki and Zuma on stage remained seated, as did the majority of delegates, seemingly stunned by what they'd just witnessed. I felt similarly stunned. I had been an ANC supporter myself since finding my own politics in my early 20s, and like everyone else present, I recognized that South African politics would never be the same. I had witnessed one of those tectonic shifts that moves a country from one epoch into another, but it would take months or even years to understand exactly what this meant. Umshiniwam was sung again and again during the conference. It was the final humiliation of Thabo Mbeki, for there was little doubt on whom the machine gun was trained. So I suppose what I'm considering now, a few months after publishing that, after writing that and publishing it, is what is the nature of that tectonic shift? Has it revealed itself? Is it the shift that it seemed to be at this extraordinary moment where for the very first time there was competition within the family of the liberation movement? Or is there more of a continuum? Are there perhaps temblers in the granite rather than, a seismic split? Certainly if one looks at the election results from last April, one wouldn't see anything suggesting tectonic shift. The ANC won a majority of 65% as opposed to 69% the previous year, which means that they didn't have the two-thirds majority required to change the constitution if they so wished, but still a very significant majority. There's much in the way that the business of politics continues in South Africa that suggests, on the surface at least, a continuity. But it's worth interrogating that continuity and seeing how things might be different. I've been very fascinated as a participant and observer in South African politics, watching what happened since that defeat of Thabo Mbeki in 2007. The immediate consequence, he was still president of the country and was to have remained president of the country until the elections of April 2009. But he kind of abdicated his responsibility almost immediately. Those close to him said he suffered something of a nervous breakdown. And to understand that nervous breakdown, one needs to understand that for people like Mbeki and Zuma, the party is your family, it's your life. Mbeki was the son of Governor Mbeki, who had sacrificed his own life for the ANC and the freedom of his people. The ANC had become a surrogate family for Mbeki, as it is for Zuma. All desires, all emotions, all subjectivity had been sublimated into the movement, which is not uncommon. I mean, Lenin writes about how the true revolutionary forsakes his biological family in favor of an ideological family. So for that family to have banished Mbeki the way it happened at Polokwane was a bit like Lear's banishment. It really was being sent away by your own family. His withdrawal from being president had some terrible manifestations. It was a period of great upheaval in South Africa. There was a wave of xenophobic violence in which hundreds of people were killed, and Mbeki was entirely absent. there was also a power crisis as a result of bad planning of Mbeki's government that resulted in the mines being shut down, which is, South Africa's lifeblood. He was absent for that too. And as this was happening, an extraordinary anger developed against him. And there was almost this sort of culture of regicide. There was something about, we've got to get rid of this man, off with his head. He's responsible for all our problems. And objectively, that wasn't fair, because despite many reasons to be very, very angry with Mbeki, not least his AIDS dissidence, which correctly has been described as having prevented the lives of tens of thousands of people being saved. His decision to stand at Polokwane too, as I mentioned, caused a lot of anger. But despite very real reasons to be angry with him, South Africa was stable. The political peace, which prevented the civil war that was expected in the early 90s, had not happened. Whether you like them or not, the neoliberal, as they were called, policies of the Mbeki administration, Mbeki was pretty much Mandela's prime minister too. So those policies had stabilized South Africa's economy and grown South Africa's economy. Despite the sort of label of neoliberalism, Mbeki had actually implemented a social welfare system which gives more per capita than any other social welfare system in the developing world. And a quarter of South Africa's population depends entirely on childcare grants, old age pension grants. There's not a basic income grant at all, but there's a huge annual disbursement. And this has been a major change in South African society. Unemployment has been incredibly high in South Africa, unacceptably high, and that's very linked to the South African crime epidemic. But in the Mbeki years, particularly towards the end, even the unemployment figures were contracting. That's all changed because of the global meltdown. But it's interesting to ask why there was such anger against Mbeki, given that the society had seemed to be doing so well in so many ways. And I think there are a few answers. One answer is that Jacob Zuma, as an uneducated, managed to present himself to the population as an uneducated outsider who had been ejected from the banquet of victory because he wasn't smooth enough or sophisticated enough to hide his corruption. He was seen as he was fired by Mbeki in 2005, and he was fired by Mbeki, it turns out, as part of a political conspiracy to get rid of him, because Mbeki saw him as a threat to his power, even though the two of them had been such close friends. But the case that was used as the reason for firing him involved like a few million rand, a few $100,000 instead of millions or billions. And it was seen that Zuma was sort of seen as a victim, as some kind of sacrificial lamb who was being held to account when others had made much more. And so he sort of tapped into a sense of alienation, of outsiderness that many South Africans had as they watched this kind of sometimes obscene feasting at the banquet of victory. That was very much part of a program that Mbeki instituted called Black Economic Empowerment, which was basically a form of comprador capitalism, which enabled you, based on the Malaysian Bumiputrization, it was meant to be about indigenizing the economy. But what basically happened is that if you were well connected, you got a share of white capital for doing very little other than being well connected. And so as the divisions in South African society grew, even though the economy was stable and growing, South Africa's Gini coefficient got higher during the Mbeki years. And one of the significant differences is that a black middle class now found itself on the right side of that Gini coefficient. So there was a sense by a majority of being excluded and being alienated, and Zuma became their man. And he very brilliantly managed to use all the evidence against him as more evidence of the fact that he was being victimized. So when a woman stood up and accused him of rape, a woman who was one of his closest comrades' daughters, very vulnerable, and coincidentally HIV positive, I don't think that's nearly as shocking as the fact that she was young and vulnerable and the daughter of a close comrade. He, rather than the majority of South Africans, according to opinion polls at least, rather than being outraged the way global opinion appears to have been, felt that this was just another plot against him and that he needed to be protected against these calumnies. And this was due to a very brilliant campaign of allowing himself to be described as a victim, even though, of course, he might be uneducated, he might have come from a very poor rural peasant background, but he was as much part of the ANC elite as Thabo Mbeki was. He rose within that elite in the ANC in exile. So that was one reason for the anger against Mbeki. Another reason had to do with, I mentioned that being a member of the ANC for people like Mbeki or Zuma is not like being a member of the Democratic Party for Hillary Clinton, or maybe for Hillary Clinton, because she does see it as her family, perhaps. But there is a sort of atavistic politics of family that exists in the ANC. And that I would say is one of the reasons why the vote for the ANC remains so strong, just as the vote for ZANU-PF remains so strong in Zimbabwe, even though all those Zimbabweans voting for ZANU-PF are clearly voting against their best interests. Not so clear in South Africa. But something happens that gets people in a democracy to vote against their interests. It has something to do with the politics of family. Very interestingly, I mean, Jacob Zuma, the jury's out as to whether or not he's going to be a good president. But on the evidence before the ANC, he was a shocking choice compared to other people who might have been the president. He had clearly managed his finances terribly, which is how he had got into this mess that had led to the fraud and corruption cases. He had shown appalling judgment in the rape case, even if he wasn't guilty of rape. He had allowed a kind of demagogic populism, which is completely counter to the ANC's very sane, civil, in the best sense of the word, traditions. The ANC's never been particularly militant, but so that's the tradition. He allowed a demagogic populism to kind of run riot, almost out of control, outside of his rape case. On the balance of that evidence, given that he was probably going to be standing trial, it was only just days before the election that the charges against him were dropped, and we'll get to that. Given that he was going to be standing trial, why on earth was the ANC so determined to make this man their president? South Africa was going to have a president on trial and perhaps found guilty for fraud and corruption and racketeering. And the answer is as one of, or part of the answer is as one of Zuma's lieutenants put it in an interview. But you hear that, I'm just giving you one citation of this. You'll find many, many statements like this, is you don't dispense with a family member just because it's convenient. So, okay, this guy might have done wrong, but he's part of our family. What are we going to do? Dump him? He was next in line to be president. In a family, you don't sort of forfeit the rights of primogeniture just because the oldest son is a wastrel. That was the logic. And conversely, Mbeki had behaved in an anti-familial way by trying to get rid of Zuma. Now, the criticisms against Mbeki were that he'd done it underhandedly, but I guess stuff often happens underhandedly in families. There's a different logic that applies. That was only part of the criticism. The main part of the criticism was, you are putting a knife in your brother's back. You should have defended him. And certainly, again, anecdotally and according to what I think are reliable polls, Zuma garnered a lot of sympathy from that dynamic. Once Mbeki had been defeated as president of the ANC, and then 8 months later ousted as president of the country because a judge ruled that there was evidence of political conspiracy in the charges against Zuma. That judgment was later overturned, but the judgment nonetheless led to Mbeki being ousted as president and replaced by a temporary president until the elections. So there was a temporary president named Kgalema Motlanthe for a few months until Zuma was inaugurated a couple of weeks ago. And there was something about this era that, there remains something about this era, which I've been describing in my writing as a second transition. If our first transition in South Africa was the early 1990s, there's something of a second transition happening now. I mean, you could, if you wanted to call it the sort of neo-colonial moment. I think it's too early to call it that, but something's shifting. And as in the first transition, there's very high expectations, unreasonably high expectations from one sector of the population, and there's a huge amount of fear and anxiety from another sector of the population. There's a sort of lack of clarity. If you look at the cabinet that Zuma has appointed, there's a possibility of some quite substantial policy changes in South African politics for the first time. There's a new cast of characters as well for the first time. There's also a lot of economic instability, as there was in the mid-90s. Of course, now the economic instability is exacerbated. Its roots are in the global economic crisis, but it's exacerbated by capital's uncertainty about what the future is going to bring. So those two are coming together in what could be a very dangerous situation. It's unclear what kind of policies Zuma's government is going to follow, because he's taken this approach, which might prove to be brilliant politics, of being all things to all people. And that's how it's not dissimilar to the way the coalition formed around Kibaki to get rid of Moy, or the way a coalition formed around Chiluba to get rid of Kaunda, or even maybe the way a coalition is formed around Tsvangirai to get rid of Mugabe. It's too early to track that. But Zuma had to pull together this coalition which would get rid of the increasingly unpopular Mbeki. He had to be all things to all people. He had to cobble together a coalition of many different spheres of influence. And his way of doing it was to say to everybody, you're welcome. So what we now have, whereas we used to have one finance minister who was responsible for economic policy, we now have four. One of them is Trevor Manuel, who's been given the responsibility of head of a state planning commission, which means he's the former finance minister, and he's the guy the markets love. So he's given a post, even though he's the bête noire of the left, which was behind the Zuma revolution. He's given a post to please the markets. The left, and specifically the organized labor movement, which is very much part of the state in South Africa, it's not an organ of civil society, and it's a ruling alliance with the ANC, sees this and is really unhappy, so insists that their guy, Ibrahim Patel, is given the Ministry of Economic Development. And there's a third man who's the finance minister called Pravin Gordhan, who is liked by the markets because he ran the revenue services very well, but has a left background. And Zuma's approach is a kind of team of rivals approach. Like, you can all battle it out. The comment that's been made about this, and it's a comment I agree with, is that you've got to be Lincoln or Obama to sort of keep your team of rivals together when they don't agree. And this crew is not going to agree. And it's unclear whether Zuma has the power, intellectual or political, to forge that kind of agreement when this contention happens. It's great after the kind of top-down hegemonic approach of the Mbeki era to have a president in South Africa who's talking about we need contention and we need a diversity of voices. Everybody needs to be heard. But it's not clear exactly how that's going to affect South African politics, and also who's going to be able to be heard, who's going to have the power to be heard. The labor movement will be heard because they were partly responsible for Zuma's victory. Organized business will be heard because they're organized, and there's a sort of object lesson, which is, I think, something really important to watch in terms of allowing all these voices to be heard. That's happening at the moment, that I think is going to be the key issue to watch in South African politics in the short term, and which is going to give us insight into what the Zuma era is going to be like. And that is that under Mbeki, a huge investment was made in public transport, because there's no public transport in South Africa, despite the fact that there's a huge urban proletariat. And as a consequence, there's a private taxi industry, which is black-owned. So it pumps money back into black communities because the owners of these minibuses are black. But they're totally ungovernable. They're beyond the law. And in South Africa's major cities, a rapid transit system has begun to be built. The infrastructure is already there. The streets have been pulled up. The rails, the tram rails have been put down into the earth. And 3 days before the election, there was a news item that Zuma had met the taxi industry. And because the taxi industry was threatening to disrupt the elections by not transporting people to the polls, he had agreed to a moratorium on this rapid transit system. And this was sort of hailed as a great victory. You know, Zuma, the peacemaker, has made the polls possible. But he also empowered the taxi industry to such an extent that a couple of days after the elections, the taxi industry put out a statement. They had only previously been calling for a moratorium. And a couple of days after the election, they put out a statement saying they're just letting Zuma and the transport minister settle down, but they want to make it absolutely clear that as soon as the new government is settled down, they are going to resume their calls to stop this rapid transit system entirely. Now, anybody who's been to Joburg will see that this is a clock you can't reverse. The streets are already totally pulled up. It's got to be in place in time for 2010, the World Cup, because it's going to be the main way of transporting people between the stadiums. It's impossible. It's an absolute impossibility to stop this. But this is the kind of contention that's going to happen in the Zuma era, and how this contention is going to be managed is going to be fascinating. I mean, I think it's going to make for a very rich politics. But there's not at the moment a sort of civil society organization of commuters who are going to stand up against the taxi industry and say, hey, we need cheap, safe transport, so back off. At the moment, those people are ANC voters, and ANC relies for its support. It was able to run its campaign. Zuma's able to, until he became president, support himself because of donations, particularly from the black business sector. So there's all this kind of impossible contention, even within the ANC, that has to be resolved. And Mbeki, love him or hate him, was kind of beholden to no one, which was perhaps one of his problems, in that he kind of took a very vanguardist approach, something he learned at the Lenin School in 1969, to running South Africa. I've got the answers, I know the truth, the rest of you follow, which is one of the reasons why he was not open to persuasion when it came to HIV/AIDS. He was like a head of the pack. That's part of his self-identity. And there are other reasons, too, that we can talk about. Zuma has a very different approach. There's going to be a lot of good to it. Cyril Ramaphosa, who is somebody who arguably should be the South African president, one of the architects of the South African Constitution, and now one of these major comprador capitalists I was talking about, has been quoted publicly as saying, in the ANC now, since Mbeki left, the windows are open, the doors are open, everyone can talk. It's a sort of 1,000 flowers can bloom moment. And he's not wrong. I mean, there's a kind of excitement about debate and contention that's happening in South Africa at the moment, which is quite contagious. People are sort of speaking their minds freely. There are lots of ideas. There's a sense of a lid having been taken off. But there's a couple of questions to ask about that. The first question is, why was the lid on in the first place? I mean, South Africa has a free press. a history of debate and contention? Why was it that there was such obeisance to Mbeki, that he was allowed to, that people didn't feel free to challenge him on his HIV policies, on some of the ways he dealt with race? What was it about the ANC that enabled a kind of a patriarch to sit up there and stifle debate within such a democratic society? That's the first question to ask. And the second is, if it is systemically within the ANC, sort of contrary to its self-image, that there is a kind of hierarchical, autocratic approach, why would it be different? Why should it be different once Zuma's in power? Was what we were experiencing, this open windows, this open doors, was this an election campaign? You know, when you have to take to the streets to talk to the people. That's what people do in an election campaign. Was it a Prague Spring? Has there been a sort of, that 2 terms, 3 terms moment, is that real? Will Zuma be recalled if he remains unaccountable? Or was that just a moment that facilitated a kind of change from one regime to another? Are the windows going to close now that there's a new set of people who are in power with its new palace guards and a new set of interests to protect? I think the jury's out on that. But one of the things that concerns me is that there is evidence that, well, I wrote a piece in South Africa recently where I asked, is Jacob Zuma the new Thabo Mbeki? And the reason why I wrote that piece is because Zuma's ticket has been very much, his ticket and the ticket of the coalition around him, get rid of this Mbeki who's been abusing state power, abusing the organs of state to mount a vendetta against me, Zuma, and others. So Zuma's supporters, a lot of the people who are the loyalists, also feel like they were victims of these Mbeki vendettas. Mbeki using particularly the National Prosecuting Authority and its elite investigative unit, the Scorpions, to hit his enemies. Now Zuma came up with evidence that this indeed was the case. And as a consequence of that evidence, charges against Zuma were dropped just a few days before the elections, a couple of weeks before the elections. It's now pretty much incontrovertible. Even if Zuma had been on the take in the beginning, it's incontrovertible that there was some kind of conspiracy against Zuma. And the legitimate assumption to make is that Mbeki was behind that conspiracy. And there have been other examples as well, proven, I think, of Mbeki having abused the organs of state to mount his personal and political battles. But the question needs to be asked, how did Zuma come across this information that managed to get him off the hook? And the answer is by an exactly, a similar abuse of the organs of state, which is that what landed in Zuma's lap were taped recordings of conversations that were made by the National Intelligence Agency. These recordings could only have been given to Zuma illegally because of Zuma's connections within the intelligence agency and because the intelligence agency, like all of South Africa's security agencies, have been divided into Mbekiites and Zumaites. And clearly, once people in the intelligence agency saw that Zuma was going to be their new boss, they changed sides. And Zuma was given this information illegally, wiretap information illegally, which enabled him to call the National Prosecuting Authority and say, look, I was right. There was a conspiracy against me. The National Prosecuting Authority, also aware of who its new bosses were going to be, because it was obvious Zuma was going to win the election, didn't ask any questions about the illegality of this material. They said, wow, you're right. There has been a conspiracy against you. We're dropping charges. So I think there's very troubling evidence that a kind of arrogance that is set in the ANC, that it must be said is a consequence of being a de facto one-party state over 15 years, will remain. And I suppose I want to conclude by talking a bit personally about where that's led me, which is that for the first time in my life, in April, I voted against the ANC. And that was a very, very difficult thing to do. It was in part because of a dissatisfaction with Zuma, and specifically with a feeling of his having made bad judgments, but also with a worry that I have personally as a gay man, that the new struggle in South Africa is going to be your culture wars, which you guys have been through for the last 20 years, between a sort of moral right and a liberal left. And Zuma has made many statements, even though he talks when he needs to, off a script, about civil rights and about the rule of law and the Constitution. When he's talking extemporaneously, he talks about beating up gay men, sending pregnant women off to, removing them from their families and sending them to school. He urges churches to speak their minds about the issues that really concern them. Abortion. Abortion is legal in South Africa, as is gay marriage. And I think that is going to be one of the splits that's going to happen in South African politics over time. But that aside, those reasons aside, it did seem to me like, even though I was very unhappy with the opposition, I don't have any home in South Africa's opposition. It seemed to me that if as a white South African, I'd been voting with the ANC all my life as a way of, as an obligation, as a way of healing South Africa's very difficult past, and aligning myself with the aspirations of the majority, it seemed like it was my democratic responsibility this year to align myself with the minority. Not necessarily the racial minority, because for the very first time, there were significant... there's no one in my world, professional, mixed race, intellectual world, Johannesburg, Cape Town, who voted easily for the ANC this year. Some of my friends voted for the ANC because they felt they had no option. Most did what I did and sort of voted in protest for an opposition party. And it was a very difficult moment to stand in the queue with a whole lot of people who I knew were all going to vote ANC and I wasn't. It made me feel sort of different and apart in a way that I hadn't before. But still, what I think gave me hope and courage is that even though we are demographically insignificant, well, not that insignificant, the ANC lost 4 or 5%, but most of that 4 or 5% in fact went to the Mbeki faction, which is the COPE, which is in fact a faction of the ANC. It's not an opposition. So really, the people who feel like me, who need a kind of new movement, are a minority and statistically very insignificant, but growing. And it's particularly heartening to speak to young South Africans, what in South Africa we call the born frees, people who have no lived experience of apartheid and oppression. They might have a lived experience of poverty, the consequences of apartheid and oppression, but they're going to vote for the party that they believe is best doing the job. And the majority of them voted for the ANC this year, but not for the atavistic reasons, I think, that over 40% in Zimbabwe still vote for ZANU-PF, but because really they were in terms of policy, the ANC was still the best party. But young people don't feel this kind of family atavistic link to the ANC that their parents do. And that is a sign of political maturation that I think is worth celebrating. I mean, we might do the full circle. There might be a time in 20 years' time where those of us who are unhappy with the ANC now will be voting for it again, just like my Indian friends are absolutely overjoyed that Congress won the way it won in the last elections, even though they would have not voted for Congress in the past. I suppose in conclusion, that's what I wanted to leave you with. And I suppose when I think about that, I think that the benchmark of the Zuma presidency is going to be whether he does enable a kind of multipartyism, a kind of growth of civil society that has, in a way, been co-opted by the ruling party to date. And that's what I think we need to watch for, and that what we all as South Africans need to carry on fighting for. Thank you very much.
I think normalization is democracy with the courts. The very fallible. And the other thing is, you made the comparison with India and people complicated relationship with Congress also as a bad. But what I'm hearing in one version of what might happen, less ZANU-PF and that road than the Institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico, of a party with a revolutionary past and patronage present where there really is no outside, and just how long it will take before there is significant enough opposition to really take over. So you may not have anything to say about Mexico, but I think that's a useful comparison. Start with the normalization maturation.
I'm not sure if I have anything to say about the normalization maturation, so I'll just skip to the second one. I mean, I suppose it's normal for a democracy to mature. But in terms of yeah, which is part of adolescence, troubled adolescence. But I think your second question is interesting, and one of the and why Mexico is actually a better paradigm than India. When the ANC split, it kind of into these two factions, and the one faction becoming a party known as the Congress of the People, or COPE, that was the Mbekist faction, if you like. That kind of really redoubled the ANC's efforts, and it was perhaps their most vibrant and certainly their most expensive campaign ever. And one of the key messages of the campaign was, don't leave the family. It's cold outside. Stay in here where it's nice and warm. Now, when you're talking in a rural area where the state is the only employer and where any resources either come through direct employment from the state, teacher, nurse, clerk, policeman, garbage man, or through tenders given from the state, provision of services, what does it mean when you say it's cold outside? And I think that in terms of researching why people voted for the ANC and why people continue to vote for ZANU-PF and why people vote for the ruling parties, the ruling revolutionary parties in places like Mexico, I think that one needs to understand patronage and cronyism and how it's affected in a society like South Africa, which is very different to the sort of multivalent federalist Indian system, where there are many, many, many points of power. So, yeah. The back there.
Is patronage one of those things that's as much a function of a one-party system as the reverse? You have something that doesn't really have a legitimate opposition, especially when you look at something like South Africa where the Democratic Party is not demographically broad-based. It's not ever going to be the full-on opposition of the party in power unless something changes. Can you have something that's not patronage-based?
Can you just explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, my thought is sort of, you have right now a party that is 65% of the country. You're going to have somewhat patronage, somewhat, I don't know exactly the words you want to use, but there's some corruption that's innate with a party that's never going to lose power until something changes. In terms of the opposition, the only real couple viable parties are things that are not demographically broad-based, and they don't have a full future. I'm not quite sure what your thoughts on that are and where that leads potential future avenues.
Well, as I said, I think the best insurance against a sort of closed system of patronage is a viable multi-party system, but also a viable multi-party system in a thriving economy where the state does not have such power as a dispenser of resources and largesse. And we're nowhere near that yet in South Africa on both counts, which is troubling. And many of us were very disappointed that COPE ended up being an Mbekist faction rather than a new political movement. I don't know if that answers your question.
And well, then I guess the next step is, what do you think the future will hold to get there? How do you think South Africa needs to change today to become a vibrant multi-party democracy?
Well, in the absence of it becoming a vibrant multi-party democracy, there needs to be as strong a civil society as possible. And there already is. I mean, compared continentally, I mean, there's no civil society on Africa like you find in South Africa. It's one of the big differences between South Africa and Zimbabwe, in terms of a free press, in terms of an industrial commercial sector, in terms of an NGO sector. One of the big problems, I mean, perhaps electoral reform is an answer, because the South African system is entirely about it's entirely proportional representation. There are no constituencies at all above local government. In local government, there are wards. But above that, it's entirely PR, which means that at ANC headquarters, they decide who their elected representatives are going to be. And there's a very mediated accountability. Now, this is really good for minority parties, because and that's why we have it. It was part of the political compromise. It means that if you're a small minority, you're still going to be able to sit in parliament, but you're not in any way directly accountable to your constituency the way you guys in the States understand and exercise accountability. So electoral reform is one approach. The problem with electoral reform is that even though you might have accountable politicians, you might have less of an opposition in parliament. But the accountable politicians will be forced to be accountable to their constituencies, even if they're within the ruling party, whereas at the moment they're a rubber stamp.
I have two questions. First, though, I have to say I have a little trouble with your analysis of Chicago. Just for the record, I think your definition of a liberated zone is a bit problematic. And I would like to invite you to travel with me around Chicago, past Hyde Park, past downtown, and would refer you, in fact, to a number of writings that come out that look at the global apartheid character of Chicago. Having said that, I want to say also I have tremendous respect for the work that you've done. Just tremendous respect. And I want to ask you about, therefore, two things. But I'm concerned because of this liberated zone that my heart is very beating on how you answer these things. First is a question about your characterization of the code people as just being Mbekis. A number of comrades that I know for many years voted Coke. I don't think they're just Mbekis. They are people who were seasoned political people who rejected all that Mbeki stood for. And many of them have had very troubled struggles in places like the trade union sector, where they stood up against those leading and shouting for the death. They were willing to die for the new dispensation. So I'd like to ask a question about that characterization. The second question that I have is a question about what do you see as possible that's going to differentiate South Africa in this new period? If it was the moral high ground of a past day, in this new period, as we're looking at just geometric inequality of income, disparate and frightening desperation that's taking place, where is it going to come from? The new mobilization that's past this immediate period. Who's going to do it? Who's going to lead it? Those are the two questions.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was dripping with irony with the liberated zone. I'm sorry if that didn't come across. I understand, of course, that Chicago is not a liberated zone. I was talking about the sort of CNN images. in the same way that there are kind of images of South Africa as a liberated zone because of Mandela that are clearly masking exactly the deep iniquities you were talking about. So I wish, unfortunately, this is my first visit to Chicago. I'm leaving in the morning, but I'll take your number, and I'd really love to understand the depths of the city. And I've read a lot of what you referred to. There was a struggle within COPE between the people you describe and the people who I would describe as Mbeki middle managers. And I think the Mbeki middle managers won. That's not to say that COPE is made up entirely of people whose sole or major intention is to protect Mbeki's legacy or keep some sort of political power now that they've lost their power in the ANC. I know and respect many people in COPE who are now sitting in Parliament and who made this election happen. And most of my friends who didn't vote for the ANC voted for COPE with a heavy heart. I didn't. I didn't vote for the DA either. I did a protest vote for Patricia de Lille because of the role she'd played in exposing the arms deal. So that's my answer on the COPE thing. It's an interesting and provocative question as to where change is going to come from in this next phase. And provocative because I think you know what you're asking, and you're suggesting that it might not come from the state, which is where it had been always imagined it would come from. Am I right? I mean, yeah. There were such vibrant social movements in South Africa in the 80s that were all absorbed into the ANC hegemony once the ANC came into power. And for me, it's going to be really interesting to track whether these reestablish themselves. Perhaps the one area where they did reestablish themselves during the Mbeki era was the Extraordinary Treatment Action Campaign that lobbied for access to AIDS medication, and that became a mass movement. And that's something of a template for mobilization. I mean, I would love there to be a commuter. I mean, you can hear I'm a little bit obsessed with this transport issue. A commuters movement. Is that going to come up? But that's one place. The other place where I think we need to look, unpalatable though it might be, is at the private sector. Because one of the things that differentiates South Africa from most of its neighbors is the reach of capitalism and the reach of indigenous capitalism rather than foreign capitalism. And really, given the scarcity of resources in South Africa, particularly now with the credit crunch, public-private partnerships become more important. And there was a very interesting way that those kinds of connections were being made in the very first years of the democracy, in the early 90s, through institutions like NEDLAC, the National Economic, I can't remember what it stands for, but a forum where business and labor and government met. It still exists, but it's become moribund. And I think there's very interesting possibilities there that will have to be explored. And I don't claim to understand Brazilian politics very well, but there's a way that the Brazilian government has been working that seems to be something of a template. I say as someone who doesn't really understand Brazil, but from an outsider's perspective.
Thank you for coming here at the university and a very insightful speech tonight. Correct me if my geography or history is wrong regarding how South Africa evolved. I read one time a book on the Langdon sisters. The Langdon sisters of Virginia, 4 of them. One of them became Lady Nancy Astor, another one the Gibson girl, another one married this prominent economist in Britain. but somehow through the book I read it, there was an organization called the Kindergarten. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Maybe I can Google it, but it had something to do mostly with East Africa and also with South Africa. But it also touched on something very, very tragic in that the concept of imprisonment and also, I assume, concentration camps involved in South Africa. How did that come about? Or who was responsible for that?
Do you mean concentration camps that arose in the Anglo-Boer War?
It was evolved, the idea was studied by the Dutch and the Boers that were there, and then they influenced people further north.
It's not an area of specialty of mine, I'm sorry.
I have a question. Bishop Tutu obviously raised different points with regard to the same moral position of Zuma. As we know, he is very influential in the past in South Africa's standing in the world and also in moral position. How strong is that voice of the Tutus in South Africa today?
Well, demographically didn't have much impact at all if you look at the election results. But we were speaking, and in a way this talks to your question, sir, about, civil society. I left out the churches. And if one looks at, I suppose when I was talking about the vibrant role of civil society in the 80s, the churches were a huge part of that. And there's an extraordinary tradition in South Africa, particularly within the Anglican Church, of speaking truth to power. And, it's not just in terms of holding the government to account, but also in terms of church issues like ordination of women, ordination of gay men, gay marriage. There's a way that South Africa is very different from the clerical establishment in the rest of the continent, and that's a great insurance, I think, for the democracy. And what's interesting is both of Tutu's successors as Anglican Archbishop have carved out for themselves a similar role in his shadow. There was a question here. Yeah.
I'm wondering, how do you see the issue of ethnicity fitting into this idea of the tectonic shift and this, the new but very different politicized Zuluness that has arisen once again in opposition to like the Cosa Nostra and this becoming dangerously close to maybe proving that there isn't quite so much South African exceptionalism. And I'm wondering how much of this is media hyperbole and how much of it is lived experience.
Okay, that's a great question. The Cosa Nostra, for those of you who don't know, is sort of South African political slang for the ANC political elite, which comes from the Eastern Cape and is Xhosa speaking. And Zuma is Zulu speaking from the province of KwaZulu-Natal. I think that there are two parts to an answer to that question. The first is that in terms of tectonic shifts, the greatest tectonic shift happened provincially in KwaZulu-Natal, where Chief Buthelezi, who was the standard bearer of Zulu ethnic chauvinism, has receded and has been replaced by Jacob Zuma. There's no question that the majority, one can't say the majority, that Zuma did incredibly well in KwaZulu-Natal because of his 100% Zulu Boy campaign, led by the king himself, who's a big Zuma man, the Zulu king's Goodwill Zwelithini. And that is why, the ANC lost actually everywhere else. It lost support proportionally everywhere else in the country. But the reason why it remained at 65% is because it cannibalized so much support from the Inkatha Freedom Party, which has now been eviscerated. And it also brought new voters to the polls in KwaZulu-Natal who have never voted before. And there is a kind of, it's our turn now, discourse that you'll hear in KwaZulu-Natal, and what you certainly heard outside the court cases and the rape trial and the corruption charge cases, which were all took place in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. There was a lot of that kind of aggressive ethnicist discourse. That being said, I think what's extraordinary about South Africa and why one can make a case of exceptionalism continentally is that despite that, Zuma kind of did brilliantly in the Eastern Cape, where Cope, which was playing a strong Xhosa ethnicist card, only gained its support in the urban areas of Port Elizabeth from a middle class. And rural Xhosa people from the Ciskei and the Transkei voted for the ANC in droves, even though it was led by this alleged Zulu ethnicist. And Zuma also played really well in the rest of the country, where the people are neither Zulu nor Xhosa, where they're not Nguni at all, where they come from an entirely different group of nations. And that's interesting. And that says something, I think, about the power of the Zuma campaign, that people were able to say, he might not be from where I am from, but he's from somewhere. He's a son of the earth. He understands rural people. He understands poor people. He might be uncircumcised, because that's the big thing in the Eastern Cape. He might be uncircumcised, but hey, that's his tradition. And at least he's in his tradition, unlike Mbeki, who was sort of floated above any kind of homeboy identity. I also think it's a function of the proletarianization of South Africa, that there is a larger urban working class in South Africa than there is proportionally in any other sub-Saharan African country. And so relationships to ethnicity are certainly there, no question that they're there, but they're attenuated. They're different to relationships to ethnicity, I understand, than in places like Zimbabwe or Kenya.
One last question.
I guess my question was about the bomb freeze. And generally that it seemed during the election that sort of Cope and the DA were really trying to sell themselves to appeal, especially to the sort of, let's say, urban middle class of groups of Africans which haven't really experienced poverty. Whereas the ANC was appealing much more to this family rhetoric. And I'm wondering what you think, how the ANC might start shifting some of its rhetoric to capture that group, because given...
How the ANC might shift its rhetoric.
If it will. Because it's just given the scarcity of skills in South Africa, and the small size of the middle class comparison, that group's not a major voting bloc, but it's an important group to have.
I'll tell you something very interesting. I wrote incorrectly that the ANC was going to lose the black middle class. And I thought that Cope was going to do much better than it did in Gauteng, which is Joburg, which is where the black middle class, sort of home of the spiritual, practical home of the black middle class. And there was this extraordinary phenomenon in the weeks before the election where you would drive through Joburg's sort of wealthy northern suburbs, and like every second black BMW had a big Zuma sticker on it. Or you'd go shopping in Sandton City, which is, you know, the monument to conspicuous consumption. And like everybody, well not every, but many very well-dressed shopping black people had ANC or Zuma pins on them. And I don't know what that's about. I think that needs some research. But I would hazard a guess that it's about going with the winner and about how unstable the black middle class is in terms of access to its own resources as opposed to access to resources that the state can provide.
There is one question left about the future of South Africa.
You are holding the last question.
I'm holding the last question. It's the question that every South African really needs to know. who's going to win the 2010 World Cup? As always, Mark, you've provoked us. You've given us an enormous amount to think about. And thank you for coming this far. And thank you for the book, which is a contribution to the South African past, present, and future. As always, you have informed, you've challenged, you've provoked, and you've given us an enormous amount to think about. Thank you.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.